Hey there, guardsmen. This is Captain Too Tall from Too Tall War Games, and today I'm actually going to go over my experience at Cagbash. It was a grand tournament hosted in Hamilton, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. I want to say that it was a great tournament. I had a blast. All of my opponents were awesome. And yeah, it was kind of interesting seeing how the meta was so different from what I was expecting to see. And we're just going to take a bit of a dive into what happened there. So with that, let's hit it. So guys, I'm going to run through my experience at Cagbash. It was an awesome time. All of my opponents were really good guys. One of them was actually already a friend of mine. It was just an overall amazing experience. If anyone lives in Ohio, I really suggest checking it out next year, because there is like a whole, there are a bunch of different events that you can enter. It's not just Warhammer, but it's a really fun weekend. There was something I kind of wanted to critique for Cagbash before I get into my experience there. Most of the 2,000 point tournaments that I attend are 3-hour rounds. Cagbash is a 2.5-hour round with 15 minutes supposed to be for setup, but I often found that the 15 minutes was meant more for me to collect my models hurriedly onto my board and then run and find the next table. And then by the time we actually started setting things up, we were a few minutes into the round, and then we had about an hour each to play, and it seemed very rushed. My first round actually we only took about 3 turns each, and it was a little, everything went a little faster than what I like. My last round did go to the full 6 turns, but that was mainly because, as I'll talk about later, I was basically just moving to hide and hold objectives for the last 2 turns. But I just wanted to mention, I think the rounds are a little short, but I will get on with my experience there. So round 1, I actually hit a buddy of mine, Ben Stipp. He was playing Pure Blood Angels, and it was actually a list very similar to what Steven Box, the guy who runs Vanguard Tactics, is running. And he had the unit of 10 Death Company with jetpacks. He had 3 squads of, I think, 6 Sanguinary Guard. He had a Sanguinary Ancient with the 5-up Feeling of Pain banner, which was extremely annoying. And he had a bunch of Smash Captains, Mephiston, and some Intercessors and some Incursors in his list. And I think 1 squad of Scouts. It was a very intimidating list, but I felt somewhat confident going into the round that I could deal with it. I have some tricks kind of meant for slowing down melee units, so I thought I would have some advantage going into the round. We rolled off. Ben actually rolled higher than me, so he went first, and I rolled for deployment, and I rolled 2 short maps, which was a disaster. We ended up playing on Dawn of War, and all of my models were all like clumped together, and it was terrible. He rolled pre-game 6-inch advance for his Death Company, which was huge, and then they got right up into my guardsmen before they even charged. He did the smart thing. He cleared out some screens behind that front screen of guardsmen with his bolter fire turn 1, and then he made a charge tagging, I think, 3 of my tanks turn 1, and that was pretty rough. He also wrapped some guardsmen with his incursors, which I think just the forward deploying incursors is really strong right now for Blood Angels. So that was really bad for me. So I couldn't shoot at his incursors, his sanguinary guard, or his death company. And of course, I don't hit very hard. So that was really rough for me. However, I still had about 4 or 5 tanks that were online, and I, at that point, just started playing towards the objectives. I did get his intercessors and scouts off of his backfield objectives and dropped my scions back there, which got me a lot of points. The game would not have been nearly as close as it was. And yeah, so 3 turns of my tanks being tagged and really nobody doing much of anything, because a lot of his stuff was actually bouncing off my tanks because they were stuck in combat. And so he was obviously getting kill more though, and I was getting hold, and it hold more, I think, a couple turns. And we ended the game turn 3 because time ran out. But it was a really good game, surprisingly close. We ended with a loss for me, 20 points to his 22 points. But again, it was a very good game. Ben is a good player, but I do think had a few things gone a little differently, and even if I just deployed a little better, I would have had that game. Round 2, I played against a interesting list. It was a melee chaos knight, 2 war dogs, 2 armigers, 3 plague burst crawlers, and a whole bunch of poxwalkers. And honestly, in a different meta, I could see this list doing quite well, actually. But right now, the way things are, it just gets blown off the table, which is exactly what happened in our game. We rolled, he actually took first turn, but I was able to roll Hammer and Anvil map, and he did practically nothing his first turn. And on my first turn, I blew up about 1,000 points of his army, and we called it after turn 2. It wasn't very good for him, but I was trying to be a good sport with him, and I think he learned a lot from it, and I think he will definitely revise his list. So, going into round 3, I was not expecting to see another Chaos Knight player. And this one, to me, was a little bit scarier. So this guy was playing 3 Chaos Knights with double thermals, a Helldrake, a Demon Prince, and 2 Lord Discordants. And he also had a battalion's worth of Chaos Marines just to get all the extra CP that he wanted. It was actually a pretty solid list. It's pretty scary to a lot of things. He's got really good melee threats in there, and he has good long range shooting with those knights. However, I did roll to go first, and the map that we had didn't have a ton of terrain, so I was able to just kind of clump all of my tank commanders and tanks up around each other, place my Old Grudges Warlord in the middle, and blast 2 of his knights off the field turn 1. And then on turn 2, I killed the Hell Turkey and the 3rd Knight. He did have his 2 Lord Discordants and his Demon Prince, but at that point, everything else on his side of the field was dead. So I did end up tabling him turn 3 also. But his list, I actually really like, and into a lot of other lists that were not my list, I think that it could do pretty well. I just had a lot of firepower to deal with those knights and durable units. So moving on to day 2, my round 4, I think originally I was supposed to play a pure knight list, and I was kind of trying to prepare myself for that. He had 4 big knights and a couple of the Forge World armigers. and I was just trying to prepare and see if I wanted to go first or like what the best strategy would be for that. And so I was kind of psyching myself out all night, and then I ended up playing orcs. So the orc player was, again, he was an awesome guy. He was bringing, I think they were the 3 Daka jets, 6 scrap jets, and 6 of the other variant of, I guess, orc trike. I don't know really what they're called, but he had, I think, 16 vehicles. He was basically running orc parking lot, which was hilarious, and it was actually, from what he had told me, pretty good. And really it was. He did in the game by taking out, I think, 4 or 5 of my tanks. However, it just wasn't enough. I got first turn and he was not able to hide enough. So I picked up 7 of his various vehicles in my first turn. And really after that there wasn't a whole lot he could do. However, like I said, he did pick up, I think, 4 of my tanks, and he maxed out a couple of his secondaries, which was awesome for him. And he was a good player, nothing to take away from him. But when it's parking lot against parking lot, you know, it kind of depends on who goes first and how the terrain's set up. And I just won out on that. So going into my 5th round, I knew either way I was going to end up playing Iron Hands, and both lists were almost exactly the same list. They were both still running the Leviathan Dreadnought. Now this is post-nerf. However, they're running the Leviathan Dreadnought with the Iron Father, with a Chief Apothecary, 30 Intercessors. One was running a lot of Centurions, and the other was running, I think, a couple of vehicles. Both had a few Chaplain Dreadnoughts, and yeah, it was just not looking like a good time for me. I was really struggling to find a weakness in that list, which I still don't think there is a huge weakness. But I did come up with a strategy before I knew who I was fighting, and it actually paid out. So we I get to the table and I'm facing the Iron Hands player who had the Centurions. So we roll, and I actually win the roll off, but I knew on the map that we had I did not want to go first. I wanted to pick my deployment, and I wanted to kind of huddle up in the back of my board. And I knew that his range wasn't spectacular, so besides the Chaplain Dreadnoughts, I knew I wasn't really going to take a whole lot of damage. So what I did was I deployed pretty much everything on the back of my board. I did kind of use my Chimeras and my Lehman Russ Demolishers as, I don't want to say bait, but they were the cheapest and most expendable tanks that I had. So I kind of put them out a little bit more forward. I was a little surprised on my turn 1 that the only thing he killed was one of my Chimeras. And he put a few wounds on a few other tanks, but he split fire and didn't really get a whole lot accomplished. So on my turn, I actually wipe out almost all of his infantry. I think I left a single squad of 5 intercessors, and all of his other intercessors were gone after my turn 1. So I was actually feeling pretty good about that because I cleared off both of his backfield objectives, which meant that if he was going to score Holdmore, that meant that he had to divert some of his bigger units towards those objectives. He did what I think is the smarter thing and push forward, trying to pressure me in my deployment zone. And he also took King of the Hill, so he needed to just stay in the middle. So what ended up happening in this game was basically I held more, and I got the bonus every turn because in our mission you had to hold 3 or more objectives to get the bonus. So what I ended up doing was I took my Valkyrie, advanced it up the board, dropped my Scions out of it, and they held an objective for pretty much the entire 6-turn game. And on the other side of the board, I took my Chimera, pushed that up the board, and had my Scions get out of that, and they held the other of his backfield objectives. So I knew at that point, I had 4 objectives, and I knew that I would continue to have at least 3 for the entire game because he was not going to focus on those at all. And I was also getting max recon, and I also ended up getting, I think, 3 points of old school. So I had pretty much maxed out my secondaries, and what he did was he did a very smart thing. You know, he held the middle of his board, and he was getting kill more. But I think what really did it in for him in the end was he wasn't getting the bonus, and it just barely bumped me over the top by the end of the game. So at the end of the game, it was turn 6. I had exactly a Basilisk, about 30 or 40 troops on the field, and 1 injured tank commander. And he had Pharaohs, a few Centurions, and the Leviathan Dreadnought. And that was about it. I will say, I think the rule about targeting characters behind characters with 10 or more wounds is kind of silly, especially right now with the Leviathan Dreadnought, because he made it his warlord and he had the 5-up Feel No Pain and all of that. And I knew beforehand that I needed to target his objective holders to win this game. But by the time I got around to targeting his characters, I couldn't target them because the Leviathan was standing there, and I just didn't have the firepower by that point to actually deal properly with the Leviathan. I think if I turn 1 threw everything I had at the Leviathan, it would die. But as it stood, I think around turn 3, you know, he had killed one of my demolishers. The other one was wounded. He had killed a tank commander. I think he'd actually also killed one of my basilisks. So it was just really hard to kill that thing, and I just didn't want to waste the shots. So at the end of the day, I think there are a few things I could have done differently. I know that there are a few things he could have done differently. But it was a well-fought game on both sides, and I think we both made some pretty good plays. And you know, it's always really nice facing a good player with an extremely good list, and coming out on top kind of lets you know where you stand. So, you know, I just want to thank all of my opponents. I had a bunch of really nice games, and you know, I took away a lot from this tournament. There are definitely some things that I need to work on. Screening is a big one. Honestly, placement, I was getting a little sloppy with placement in this tournament. I was protecting my Valkyrie almost too much. It only died, really, I think, in my last 2 games, and that was, I think, turns 2 and turn 4. It never died turn 1, and actually my first 3 games, it didn't die at all. So I think that I was protecting it a little bit too much turn 1. It probably could be a little bit more up front. I definitely need to practice screening a little bit better against those like Blood Angels players and White Scars who are just going to be there turn 1, because there are going to be games like my round 1 where I just get really unlucky in the first couple roll-offs, but still need to be able to impact the game. But I think that this tournament really just showed me how much, you know, that when you play towards the mission, you are either going to win or you're going to make the game very close. I really didn't have any business winning my first game, especially with how I deployed and with the amazing turn 1 that my opponent had. And my final game was against a very powerful list that I'm not really sure I had any business competing with, but I did manage to pull off a win just because I knew what I had to do and I executed my plan. So anyway, guys, this has been kind of an experimentary episode, and I would like to know your opinions. So if you could, comment down below if you'd like to see more of these. And I'm going to try to get some live feed episodes to you soon. I am getting a video camera, so that'll be exciting, and I'll keep you posted. But as always, this has been Captain Too Tall with Too Tall War Games. Game on.